From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
As an AM tech, I was doing a lot more than just setting up the builds and extracting the builds. I was doing a significant amount around the project coordination, kind of acting as an extension of the project engineers and being their eyes and ears on the ground and making sure things are going where they're supposed to. The back shop worked pretty autonomously, but I was still responsible for tracking the overall status of those projects in an effort to help with the engineers.
That's Will Cuervo. Will has been in the additive manufacturing industry for 5 years and is currently the Senior Business Development Manager at 3YOURMIND. He also serves as the Ambassador for the Additive Manufacturing Coalition. At 3YOURMIND, he is responsible for the business development strategy for enterprise companies as well as the federal government. Will started his career as an AM technician at Sintavia, where he learned the ins and outs of AM operations for aerospace, space, and defense applications. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcast, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. All right, well, thank you so much for joining the show today. Excited for this conversation. I like to start really from the beginning with all the guests, like the very beginning. So, so where were you born? Kind of what was it like growing up, and kind of what were some of those early kind of baby steps towards the industry and kind of where you are today?
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm definitely looking forward to it. This is actually my first podcast in the AM industry since I've been in the field. So I'm excited to ring it in for the first time with you and 3 Degrees. I love the content you guys put out, but just a little bit about myself. So I definitely have some close friends in the industry that know my story, but I'm really looking forward to kind of telling my tale a little bit, if you will, for the first time. And it all started, I was born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida. Grew up spending a lot of time at the beach. For those of you that have seen Lords of Dogtown, kind of like sneaking away before school and going surfing and skimboarding and stuff, that was kind of like my childhood. Not a traditional childhood by any means, but nonetheless, I was born and raised in Miami Beach. I'm a Florida boy, definitely not the Florida man, but I was born as essentially a first generation American on my dad's side. So both my mom and my dad's side are both of Cuban descent. My family lived there for not very long prior to coming to the U.S., escaping all the craziness of Cuba and communism and such. But I was really privileged to have the opportunity to grow up in a part of the world that's so unique and filled with representation from so many different folks around the world. And ever since I was a small kid, I've always been intrigued by things that are loud and fast and go boom. So naturally, space and the space shuttle generation was very intriguing to me. Naturally, on my own, I was always interested in kind of technical, mechanical type things, always getting in trouble with my parents for taking the remote control apart or finding an old appliance that nobody used to, take apart and kind of figure out what everything does. And I was always attracted to the military and government and such. So, in high school, I knew I definitely wanted to pursue something in the public sector relating to government service. Mostly military service was at the time what I was really focused on achieving. So spent 4 years in JROTC, and this is actually an important part of the story because it actually has a lot to do with how I ended up in additive manufacturing. I spent 4 years in JROTC in high school. I swam.
So can you explain for those who may not know what JROTC stands for?
Absolutely. Of course. So JROTC is the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. It's essentially kind of a junior leadership program that's modeled after the military, but by no means is it kind of grooming kids for the military. It's actually more of just grooming kids for adulthood, exposing them to how, essentially maybe what government service would look like on the side of the military. Teaching them kind of life skills, how to write a check, basic fundamentals of leadership, safe gun handling, far and wide, a lot of different kind of skills that I think are pretty important for young adults to learn on the cusp of becoming real adults. But so yeah, I did a Army JROTC for 4 years. And I really loved JROTC. It gave me the opportunity to give back to my community, to also get some really cool responsibilities at a young age. At 16 years old, I was already responsible for government property, including electronics and rifles and such. And I thought it was so cool to be young and have this opportunity to kind of like run a proxy military unit with my friends in high school, and have the opportunity to compete, in drill and ceremonies and physical events, and go to some really cool encampments as well. Did training in Camp Landing in Florida, really cool Boy Scout centers and such, and even participated in American Legion Boy State for those folks that are familiar with that program. So it was a really great opportunity for me to kind of figure out what I really liked, what I was good at. And one thing I knew is I really wanted to pursue, service in the military. So that led me to applying. I applied to one university. I didn't apply to any other schools. And it was Norwich University, which is actually the birthplace of Reserve Officer Training Corps. So kind of the original parent organization of JROTC, really old school. Nestled in the middle of Vermont, completely opposite of everything I knew, everything, I'm familiar with. So I
had a lot of Cuban food in Vermont, I'm guessing.
Yeah, not a lot of Cuban Latin food. So it was a huge culture shock, but one where I kind of knew what to expect. And the fundamental reason for doing it is, one, I've being that I wasn't exposed to it so much in South Florida, I love the idea of kind of being nestled in the middle of the mountains and having the opportunity to kind of explore a lifestyle in a mountainous region with snow and cold. So it was different, but it was something I really encouraged, especially in doing so in an effort to commission as an officer in the Air Force, which was exactly the intent. So I went to Norwich University, pursuing a 4-year Air Force ROTC scholarship. The intention was to finish college as a second lieutenant, and be able to serve in the Air Force at some capacity. At the time, I really wanted to go spec ops, so PJ, particularly one assignment they had, which was a weather parachutist, which was a special operations position. And these guys would go in and do the initial recon on land and kind of get an idea of what the weather and conditions and terrain looks like. So unfortunately, due to a car accident during my sophomore year, I was injured in my back, and nothing severe that impacted my quality of life, but enough at the time that it made me ineligible to commission and further pursue a contract to allow me to commission as an officer in the Air Force. And when I got to college, it was actually a very interesting time in the United States. My freshman year of college was 2008, 2009. The recession had just started. They were slashing the budget up left and right, including ROTC scholarships. But there was this big focus on commissioning officers that were interested in international relations, particularly with a focus in China. So, I actually took Mandarin for a year. I studied poli-sci for 4 years. And this is all important because despite the fact I didn't have the opportunity to commission, I kind of took it upon myself to realize the vision of the school I was going to. So Norwich University was founded by a gentleman by the name of Captain Alden Partridge. So in 1819, Captain Alden Partridge had left West Point, where he was a commandant of cadets. And he left West Point for one fundamental reason. As a federal academy, West Point is only going to bring in students that plan on committing to, obviously, service to the government thereafter. And he wanted to create an institution where he could provide the opportunity to go that route. But also, if you want to go to the civilian route and you're dedicated towards becoming this citizen soldier, is kind of the concept there. Taking the learnings and the disciplines of being in a military environment and kind of applying that to the private sector and to the civilian world. So he had this concept of citizen soldier, and it was really tough on me knowing, I had done all this preparation up into this point in my life, and I knew I was never going to be able to serve. I knew I was never going to wear a uniform again upon graduating from Norwich. And it was probably the first really big hiccup in my life in my young adulthood, because again, like so much of my planning went into the idea of me commissioning as an officer in the military, particularly the Air Force. But nonetheless, I really dedicated myself to my studies even more, being that I was studying political science at the oldest military college in the United States. I obviously had the opportunity to not only share the hallways with some really incredible peers, some of which were already active duty in the Marine Corps, Navy, Army, but also some really interesting folks on the civilian side of our school. And our faculty was insanely credible with a lot of different types of experience. So I really it's why we go to college, right? Is to take our academics seriously. But with military college, I had a lot of responsibilities, not only my Corps of Cadets responsibilities, my ROTC responsibilities, and of course academia. But being that it got to a point where I knew military was out of the question, really focused on academics and had the opportunity to help influence policy, work with politicians, write white papers with some really close peers at my school, and have the opportunity to meet a lot of really interesting folks. And that's where I knew I really wanted to embody the citizen soldier concept that Captain Aldrin Partridge kind of founded when he created Norwich. And, I also knew I still wanted to interface with the government in some capacity. At the end of the day, whether I was going to be able to wear a uniform again or not, I accepted that, but I knew like in my bones that I wanted to do stuff with the government, particularly with the DoD. So upon graduating in 2014, graduated a little late. If you're tracking my timeline, I started 0809, took some time off of school in between, which is another big part of my story because, in high school, I was so focused on JROTC. I didn't go to a normal college, obviously. I went to military college where I'm wearing uniform every day. I'm shaving every day. Complete opposite of a party school. It was nice to kind of take time away and pursue other things. So one little parallel blip in my timeline here in like my adulthood and starting from the beginning is the time I took spending time off college and kind of pursuing a music career, if you will, as a DJ and a producer. Music's always been a big part of my life. So you can imagine growing up in South Florida, there's a lot of music and partying and events. And that was always very interesting to me. So throughout college, I was diving into music production and DJing, and that kind of became very serious at one point, to the point where I took a whole year off of school and I was kind of just touring around Florida, doing gigs, hosting events and planning events in Miami at clubs and such. And that was an incredible opportunity, having the time to kind of like get away from wearing a uniform every day and shaving. This is once I already knew I wasn't going to really have the opportunity to commission. So and I was also able to acquire more skills that were very complementary as well, especially in the case of event planning and promotions and such. But after graduating college in 2014, again, I knew I wanted to interface with the government in some capacity. So my goal at that point, especially after writing some really cool white papers that gave me the opportunity to interface with a lot of folks on Capitol Hill and the DoD and the Pentagon and such, I knew I wanted to work at a think tank. Unfortunately, most of these think tanks are in Washington, D.C., and assistant research analysts don't really get paid a lot of money. So the transition after college was probably like the next step in my young adulthood, where I was getting my butt kicked. I was really struggling to figure out, how am I going to do what I want to do? I know I could do it. I know I could do a really good job, but I wasn't getting the opportunities that I really wanted. So it was kind of another opportunity for me to just kind of say, hey, you've spent so many years at such a young age kind of doing things that normal kids don't do, like, JROTC in high school, being in charge of logistics of, federal government property when you're 16, 17 years old, going on to a not normal college where you're not doing not normal, college things and such. So I took, some time, and I ended up becoming a Red Cross water safety instructor. So in high school, I swam. Being born and raised in South Florida, the beach and the ocean and the pool is a way of life here. So I had the opportunity to essentially work at a swim school part-time, nothing crazy, like 14 to 20 hours a week in the pool, and got my Red Cross water safety instructor. and really took pride in the opportunity of working at a swim school, working with two really cool guys born and raised in Miami Beach, just like myself. They operated this swim school, and they were teaching kids how to swim in a way that I was just absolutely impressed with. And they had a program that was teaching 10-month-old babies like swim, float, swim, survival swimming, and I was blown away. And given my attraction to service and helping out in the community, when I graduated high school, I graduated with like 350 community service hours because of JROTC. So I was sold. I was like, I know there's bigger things in store for me at some point, but again, with the pressure of not seamlessly transitioning into, a good career after college, I was like, this is going to be fulfilling for me. So I took that opportunity. I worked with kids mostly, especially kids with special needs, mostly autism, which was an absolute blast. And like, probably one of the highlights of my life, being able to see the impact I was having on these kids by working with them in the water, giving them these skills in the water. And another really fulfilling target group, and this was a program I was able to help the owners of the swim school start, which was helping young adults who were going into the Navy prepare for their swim qual. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people in South Florida who do not know how to swim. So I was oftentimes working with people in their early 20s, full grown adults, how to jump in the deep end and acquire that water confidence. And that's, in a nutshell, kind of, that was my life. And from high school into college and directly after college, that was my life before I found additive manufacturing.
So what was going a little bit like, what was your decision? So you had done Army or JROTC. Why not go down the Army path? What was specifically that drew you to Air Force? And I mean, you like to swim, so I mean, the Navy's not swimming, but like, what about Air Force stuck out?
Yeah, I guess stemming to, my early age attraction to space and aviation and such and space shuttles. I was like, being in the Air Force, even though and it's actually a great question, Mike, because I knew I wanted to be on the ground. I didn't want to be a pilot. I didn't want to be a rigger. I didn't even want to be a maintenance mechanic or anything like that. I knew I wanted to be in the ground, something combat arms oriented. And it's funny you mentioned that, because there was one slight window that gave me the opportunity to, even though I had to give up on Air Force ROTC, the Army was willing to take me in. And I was briefly in an Army program called SMP, and that didn't work out. It's called a simultaneous membership program. So while I was in Army ROTC, I was also in the National Guard very, very briefly. But I don't know. I don't know why. I guess it was just my attraction to the Air Force. At the time, they had a significantly nicer uniform than the Army. During my time as well, the Army was still wearing the pickle uniform, as it's called. Now they're wearing the pink and greens, or pink and browns, I believe they call it, even though there's no pink. But I was just always attracted to the Air Force. It was a young branch, but rich in history. And it was just something I felt I wanted to be a part of. And everybody knows it's a better lifestyle in the Air Force as well.
Awesome. So, I mean, you kind of left off nicely with that kind of introduction to kind of your early days and through college. When was the first time you heard about additive manufacturing?
So the first time I heard about additive manufacturing was actually during my senior year of college. So at this time, of course, I was kind of wrapping up my political science bachelor's degree, and my exposure to the technology wasn't even on campus either. It was actually more so online. One of the more popular ways of gaining exposure to 3D printing, which was something revolving around a firearm and a component and regulation and such. And I was like, that's a little crazy, but I was still taken away by the idea of creating a three-dimensional item from, at the time, I didn't even realize it came from a file or a 3D model. At this point, this is my initial exposure, and I'm just like, wow, they're creating 3D, objects from an idea. And I thought that was really cool. It came full circle about, I'm going to say maybe a year after I got out of college and graduated. One of my mentors from JROTC in high school, really close friend to this day, is like my big brother. We're family. Alex Bencomo. So he worked at Sintavia in its very early years. He was probably one of their first hires when they started to scale up the company and kind of transition from this startup to scale up phase. And he kept telling me, he's like, hey man, I'm working for this cool company. We're 3D printing. Have you heard of it? I'm like, I have. That's so cool. And he's like, yeah, we're 3D printing metal parts for airplanes and satellites. And I'm like, they can 3D print metal? That's so cool. So, really typical dialogue, but he told me from the first time he brought it up, he's like, I might have a good opportunity to get you in here. And at the time, being how close Alex and I are, he knew I was trying to find myself, right? At the time I was still teaching kids and adults how to swim. I was spending, a couple nights DJing bars and clubs, throwing events from time to time, having fun, being very fulfilled, doing what I was doing, but definitely not what I had in mind for life after college. So he had planted the seed very early on, within the first year I graduated college, and that was in 2014. And fast forward to October 9th, 2017, I woke up, laced on steel toe boots, put on a collared shirt, and went to my first day of work at Sintavia. Kind of fast forward a little bit. So having my first introduction to 3D printing in 2014, and my exposure to it was so small, right? I saw 3D printing in just like a little article, small video, kind of highlighting some stuff, and super small exposure, but it always resonated with me the first time I saw 3D printing. And I still look back to this day, and 3 years later, I would have never had an idea, but 3 years later, I found myself kind of, on the diving board of my career, like of my professional life, getting ready to start what I didn't know at the time, but what feels like today, the first day of the rest of my life, essentially, in regards to additive manufacturing. And, since then, I'll be celebrating 5 years in additive manufacturing this October, which would be exactly 5 years from the first day I put steel toe boots on and went to go work on the shop floor.
Awesome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of those first few days as you were kind of interviewing, and what was your mindset kind of going into a field that you'd not had a lot of early exposure to in terms of manufacturing, and kind of seeing all these machines and figuring out kind of your role on the shop floor?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a really interesting time in my life, because there was definitely a little layer of anxiousness, right? Anticipating me starting this very new and exciting part of my life. And like you mentioned, something I really hadn't been exposed to. So just one little thing, even before I worked in additive manufacturing, I was exposed to kind of an operations type lifestyle. So I did a construction management internship with a pretty reputable construction company for 2 years when I was in college. And I also spent a lot of time helping my uncle run his maritime business, which he did a lot of marine refurbishment and detailing of boats and large commercial vessels and such. So really it was not only getting exposed to a whole new world of operations, but also manufacturing. So there was two parts of it where I had a little bit of confidence, and not only my existing exposure to working in operations, and of course everything that came with all the kind of military type training and leadership training I acquired from my years of JROTC and ROTC. So I had this toolbox of things I knew I could really depend on, that I knew would make me very successful working in manufacturing. The most important is probably just being timely and very detailed oriented. But for sure, there was a large cushion of anxiety inside as I went there to interview for the first time, saw the shop floor, saw, an SLM 280 and an EOS M290 and an RCAM, Q20 plus, and saw what an industrial metal powder bed fusion machine looks like. Got an idea of what these guys are wearing. Also entered a machine shop for the first time. I had never seen a Haas CNC machine, or a hip, or a heat treat, or tensile strength, mechanical testing machine. So that was all really cool. And very shortly after I did the interview, I got the job, and there was probably this month and a half before I actually started and laced on those steel toe boots for the first time. And going into it, granted, even with this toolbox of skills that I knew would really benefit me working in operations in the manufacturing world, especially for like aerospace and defense applications, I was scared. I was like, man, how am I going to do this? What am I thinking? Like, I'm going to be supporting the work of all these engineers. I don't know anything about any of this. And one thing that became apparent to me very early on, because there's manufacturing, right? And then there's specifically working in additive manufacturing. And one thing that became very apparent to me after 2 months, and we'll cover a little bit of what my first days look like, is we're all learning something new every day in additive manufacturing. So after a little while of getting over my own stuff, the first couple weeks and months, and slowly just growing into my own and retaining all of this knowledge and information, one thing that really gave me a lot of sense of comfortability is the fact that everyone's kind of figuring it out every day. Yeah, I spent my first few weeks figuring out how to maintain traceability on powder lots and sieving, and being very cognizant that each machine has a dedicated material, and filling out AS9100 documentation and such. And that was all really cool too, to spend my first few months gaining exposure and knowledge on what it takes to actually manufacture parts for aircraft, potentially in aerospace applications. But the sense of camaraderie at Sintavia, and this kind of peer learning environment where we're all learning and we're all teaching, and this kind of equal playing field, definitely helped my transition into manufacturing significantly. And I think it goes to show the importance of having a good culture, right? When not only leveraging an innovative technology like AM, but also just working in any type of environment, the company culture is very important. And working in this company that had really big, like, billion-dollar vision, but still had like, when I joined Sintavia, I think I was maybe the 8th employee, and now they're over 50, close to 100, I think. But that added to me being a bit more comfortable in the environment, as well. As we were doing big things, but we were a really small team at the time, with still a significant amount of machines. They have even more since then, but it was a very interesting transitional period for me professionally, technically, and honestly, it was fulfilling, because I was learning things that, even though I had this interest in technical, mechanical things and rockets and automobiles and such, I ended up learning a lot of things I didn't think I had the capacity to learn. And, again, it goes back to that culture, and just having a good environment of peers and leadership, and having a good culture of just helping and teaching and learning together was very helpful, and my introduction into manufacturing, for sure.
That's awesome. And so when did the software piece come into it? When did you make that jump into kind of the machine, like operations, kind of making parts, into more of the software?
For sure. So when I started at Sintavia, I started off as just an additive manufacturing technician. And so I was at the ground floor of operations. And obviously, before you can even print the part, a lot goes into that from an engineered and design perspective. And there, after being that Sintavia is vertically integrated, a lot happens after that as well. I was in the middle of all of that as an AM tech, being that it's a small company and we're vertically integrated. As an AM tech, I was doing a lot more than just setting up the builds and extracting the builds. I was doing a significant amount around the project coordination, kind of acting as an extension of the project engineers and being their eyes and ears on the ground and making sure things are going where they're supposed to. The back shop worked pretty autonomously, but I was still responsible for tracking the overall status of those projects in an effort to help with the engineers. So I say all that because, when we talk about additive manufacturing, it's very easy to talk about all the benefits of using AM, where, it's very common in our industry to talk about all the incredible things that technology can do. But what's oftentimes let out is, actually how hard it is to use it, in any capacity, whether it's for spares or repairs, one-offs, prototyping, especially in regards to metal 3D printing for aerospace and defense applications. It's a very hard thing to do. There's a lot of information, a lot of quality assurance, a lot of things you have to document, and it's a lot of effort to constantly have to physically walk on the shop floor to get an update on something. So, during my first year and a half, which was purely spent on the shop floor working in additive manufacturing, one thing I knew is I understood the benefits. I understood what are the good things about additive when it works and things go the way they're supposed to. But I was also very in touch with all the parts of the process that needed to be improved and needed to become more intelligent and even automated when possible. So the reality is, at the end of the day, when you have a 3-week build on an M400, that machine doesn't stop when you go home, right? So that machine needs to keep running. You have to work with the monitoring tools you have. And that's a better case scenario, right? Because an M400 is a top fed machine. There's a lot of space to accumulate the material. You don't have to swap overflows. Now, SLM an SLM 280 is a different story. So, we'd run pretty long builds and working with 1, 2, 3 technicians at the height of me becoming lead technician and having a couple techs to manage. Operationally, it's very scary to keep these machines running, making sure you're going in at the right time to swap the overflows, sieve the powder, reload the machine, and do everything you need to do to ensure that the build will successfully end. So during my last few months at Sintavia, I was transitioned into kind of a different role that was going to build on my expertise on the shop floor and knowing our own processes. And they kind of moved me to this IT implementation coordinator role. So in this capacity, I was not only responsible for helping the implementation of a new software that would help manage the day-to-day operations. So like an ERP MES type capability. I was also going to be responsible for kind of being that glue, that change management officer, if you will, that would be responsible for implementing that software, not only in an IT realm, but more so in the implementing it operationally. So a lot of training went into that. And I was actually really into that. Because again, I was very in touch with everything that needed to be improved to improve the quality of life of technicians and engineers. Because again, you have to make sure that print finishes successfully, and if it doesn't, there's a lot of work to be done. And that's a textbook nightmare, right? When a 2-week build fails, or even worse, when something fails the night before it's supposed to finish. So I became very invested in understanding what exists out there from a capability standpoint that's going to, help mitigate those risks, help improve the quality of life of the people who work on the shop floor. Because just because those machines print 24 hours a day till they finish doesn't mean we should have people working around the clock. And in some cases, that's going to be what it takes, right? But, second shift, third shift, whatever, in a startup environment, it's very grueling to really make this happen. So that was kind of the beginning of my transition into the digital thread side of additive manufacturing. And because I really had to experience all the bad, nasty parts of the business, being on the shop floor on holidays, waking up in the middle of the night to rectify issues that we could have never even calculated or planned for. I knew I didn't want a lot of people to have to endure what I endured. And unfortunately, I'm sure there's still people are kind of living the nightmare side of additive manufacturing from time to time when things go wrong. But what led me to working on the software side and joining the 3YOURMIND team after a few years at Sintavia was, with this sentiment in mind. I've had to endure the negative parts of the process, but I'm also very in touch and invested in the positive sides. And I want the world to understand what the benefits of AM are. But I also knew software was going to be the part of the missing piece of the puzzle, right?
Awesome. And so we were talking a little bit before the show started about kind of some of the different projects that you've been on with 3YOURMIND, and so it's almost come full circle where you're now doing some kind of public sector work with 3YOURMIND. So maybe tell a little bit about kind of what the software does, and then maybe kind of give an example with some of the cool projects that you've been involved with.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So I actually just celebrated 3 years with 3YOURMIND this past June, I want to say. And it's been an incredible ride. Working on this side of the market is really exciting. It's also it's hard work, right? Because in some cases people are software naysayers, and they rather poke holes and why your solution doesn't work instead of really understanding how it does work and where it does work. But essentially, it's been an incredible ride. And upon joining the company, I was essentially like the first hire for the North American team. So upon joining the team, I was working directly under another Alex, another important Alex in my additive manufacturing journey. And together, he and I launched operations in North America, kicked off some projects with some really exciting Fortune 500 companies. But there was one project that I was really excited to kind of take ownership of, which I would be responsible for upon joining the team, which was a project with NIWC, which stands for Naval Information Warfare Center. It's part of one of the Navy syscoms by the name of NavWar. And this project would be centered around using the parts of our software that help big organizations essentially establish their global manufacturing network, or what some folks refer to as distributed manufacturing. So a little bit about 3YOURMIND is we're very uniquely positioned in the software space, where we provide tools that are not just point software, but rather kind of what you could call a platform approach, where we can cover large amounts of your AM workflow and act as kind of a hub for data and act as an overall framework for your AM operations, while still connecting to your legacy overarching IT systems, or in this case, your point software, so your CAD software. And essentially what we want to do is kind of consolidate AM operations into one seamless digital thread to address the three main parts of the AM workflow, which is first, the part data side of things. So part identification, what type of logic are you using to determine can you print it and should you print it? There's always a lot of talk around can you print it, what's the technical feasibility, but 3YOURMIND is really adamant about providing a framework that's going to automate the thinking you use to determine the business case behind things. Does it really make sense to 3D print this part at the end of the day, considering, you know, supply chain data, economic costs, technical implications and such? And then from there, we provide the other parts that you would need in a digital thread to allow people and teams in your organization to order parts, create projects, track those parts and projects, as well as having tools to enable the production planning part of the process. So manufacturing execution system, where you can manage personnel, schedule parts, connect to your machines, enable quality control. So all these things I was very familiar with, and that was kind of the big piece of the puzzle I was bringing to the company at the time. I was one of the first few individuals that had that type of expertise. And what was really exciting about 3YOURMIND was not only that I was gonna, you know, be a part of this team and provide the market a solution that was going to help solve some of the problems I was experiencing, but I was also going to have the opportunity to work directly with the product development team, which is something I never thought in my life I would have had the opportunity to do, which was interface with the product team of a software development company, share my learnings and understanding, and you know, be able to drive the development to some capacity, right? Because it is a big company. There's a lot of stakeholders. But keeping all that, you know, wrapping that all up, excuse me. The first big project I worked on that I can talk about is this NIWC project. And since then, we've been working with NIWC for 3 years, and we've gotten to the point where it started as a small proof of concept, where we checked off all the requirements within the you know, disclosed period of time that we agreed on, to the point where we now kind of have a really well-established relationship. We're constantly checking off requirements off of each period of performance. And, you know, we're in a position where our tools directly helping, you know, NIWC and NavWar scale a what they call a digital additive manufacturing ecosystem. So having the opportunity to interface with, you know, a team in the Navy, particularly a very cool team that does some really exciting stuff, was huge for me. And to your point of kind of coming full circle, you know, going back to my days of college and realizing I was never going to be able to put a uniform on again and work directly in the DoD, you know, as an airman, was tough. But, you know, fast forwarding a few years and starting the first few months at 3YOURMIND, kicking off a period of performance with the Naval Information Warfare Center was absolutely incredible. And since then, we've really solidified our presence in the DoD, having the opportunity to not only partner with companies like Phillips Corporation Federal Division which has been an opportunity for both parties. We add a lot of synergy to our respective skill sets and what we both do, and together we're having the opportunity to help the DoD and very niche organizations within the DoD address the complex problems, especially pertaining to part identification, what we oftentimes call part screening and selection. So we currently have a separate period of performance with AMOC, Advanced Manufacturing Operations Cell, which is a different SysCom in the Department of Navy. It's Marine Corps Systems Command. And that's been an extremely fulfilling opportunity as well, because a lot of the talk when it comes to additive manufacturing and 3D printing for the DoDs, of course, there's consideration for a lot of different use cases, but the most impactful use case is the impact additive manufacturing can have on sustainment, particularly sustainment of legacy equipment, things that I was very familiar with during my time at Norwich, and having good friends and peers and mentors that are in the Marine Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force. So one thing I was really familiar with, especially with my passion of airplanes and tanks and things like that, I know the DoD likes to get their money's worth out of weapons platforms and weapon systems and even just a basic ground vehicle. So it's been really exciting working with the Marine Corps and shaping what is going to be the logic that they use for determining readiness factors, if you will, and scoring a part and saying, this is going to be a game changer, right? Like, and being a part of that from a software perspective, digital thread, and being a part of the Marine Corps' AM journey, because they have a very refined and thought out strategy for additive manufacturing, and being a part of that to some capacity has been very fulfilling, especially with regards to an underlying goal I've always had for myself, especially after leaving Norwich, which would be to interface with the DoD and embody this kind of citizen soldier approach that I was very fond of from my university.
Awesome. And so kind of two smaller questions as we kind of get towards the end of the hour today. So first one is, you've had a lot of varying experience in different industries now in the additive space, and also a lot of training from your time in JROTC and in college. So what are some of your what's your top leadership lesson that you'd like to share with the audience? What's something that you try to strive to, or you've seen something in a trait of one of your mentors or peers that you try to embody in terms of your own leadership style?
I like that question. So there's a lot of misconceptions about leadership, that it's just something you have and it's not taught, and that couldn't be more far from the truth. It's something you have to crawl to achieving, and it's not only something you acquire from learning the textbook stuff about leadership, but also learning from bad leaders. And some of the best lessons I have in leadership are from bad leaders and bad management, from a culmination of my experience in all different types of operations, whether it's how a military college operates, how a maritime business operates, construction, or an aerospace manufacturing facility. I would say, and I want to add one other big misconception about leadership, and it's that as a leader, you need to put yourself in this chain of command where your people know you are above them. But there is one, kind of metaphor that's you hear among military folks a lot, and it's lead from the front, right? And at the core, I think this is probably one leadership trait that I always really remained with, and I really had the opportunity to kind of like flourish with this concept during my time at Sintavia, being a lead technician, having some other technicians working under me, and the work's hard, right? Flipping machines and taking huge metal parts out of a machine is tough. And I would say overall, the concept of leading from the front and not putting yourself in this kind of seat above your subordinates is absolutely critical, because when you lead from the front and you are truly invested in the success of your subordinates, and you show them you can get your hands dirty and your stuff at the end of the day, they're going to automatically put you in this kind of superior seat on their own. So it's really important as leaders that we treat our subordinates with the absolute, respect, even in those tough times. And one thing for me, which was always my anchor as a leader, was just truly being invested in the success of my subordinates. I think in general, that's kind of my recipe for success as a leader. And it's really worked for me over the years. And these are things that I've learned from good and bad leaders over the years.
Awesome. And so we've crossed 100 episodes, and one of the things I'm doing 100 onwards is kind of seeing beyond the conversation we have, kind of where do some of the folks get their inspiration or ideas from. And so I'm asking everybody kind of a favorite book they've recently read or something they're reading now that they'd like to share with the audience in terms of bringing their own or kind of gaining new knowledge and always trying to learn more.
Absolutely. I'm trying to think the name of the book, but there's one book, I forgot the title. It's actually Alex, my current boss at 3YOURMIND, suggested it. As soon as he told me about it, I got it. But it's essentially centered around being like a master of no trades, right? That it's actually very good to be a well-versed kind of understanding of a lot of different things, and not being so focused and just being an expert in design engineering or metallurgy or sales or whatever the case may be. And I'll get you the name to the book, but it resonated with me because I think after having this discussion, and you got kind of a glimpse into my, how I got to this point during MMX in Ohio recently. But I think after having this conversation, you can kind of see how I had exposure to a lot of different stuff, and I was able to pick up these little gems along the way. Some that had to do with the previous, but some that were completely in a whole different area. But I recently read this book that really honed in on the importance of having that kind of development and picking up, the gist of a lot of things. And of course, if you like one thing, you could really dive into that and a couple of other things. But that's one book I read recently, and I hate that I don't have the name off the top of my head.
Cool. Yeah. Well, email it to me. We'll put it on the list. We're going to add that to kind of the website and have a running list of books that people recommend and kind of keep that going.
Sounds good. Will do.
Well, I appreciate the time today. Look forward to seeing you, I'm sure, at one of the upcoming shows, and we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, Mike. It was a real pleasure.